Englewood has produced plenty of names worth fearing, but few moved through it the way he did. They called him Old Dog, and on a handful of blocks on Chicago's South Side, he took a group of friends and turned them into people who would kill on his word. Over 2 years, his rise left a trail of bodies that included rivals, strangers, and even his own family members. The killing that sealed his legend happened 2 hours from home in a quiet farm town, and the young man who died there, by the story Englewood still tells, was his own blood. The story starts with a death that had nothing to do with him. In April 2008, a teen party on an Englewood block spilled out of the house and turned into a fight on the front lawn. An 18-year-old named Albert Vaughn walked over to break it up, the way a decent kid does when he sees something getting out of hand, and for that, he was beaten to death with a baseball bat by a man who happened to be the cousin of one of the teenagers in the brawl. Albert had no part in the argument. He stepped into someone else's anger on a warm spring evening in front of people who knew him, and he did not walk away from it. Hold on to that detail. It is the only killing in this entire story where a cousin truly pulled the trigger, and it happened years before the man at the center of it all ever entered the picture. That death built everything that came after. Albert's younger brother Alex could not let the name die in the dirt, so he and a tight circle of friends turned their grief into something they could keep. They played pickup basketball. They gave themselves a name. They built a little world to belong to in a place that did not offer many. They called it Gooni Boss, and the whole idea was that every man in the group answered only to himself. In those first years, it was closer to a club than a crew, a way for young men who had already lost too much to stay close and stay busy. Englewood did not let it stay that way for long. This is a neighborhood where the distance between a friend group and a gang can close without anyone deciding to cross it. It carries decades of poverty and disinvestment and gunfire, the kind of place where a single death can shape a block for years, and where danger sits under even the ordinary parts of a day. The corners around 72nd and 73rd Streets near Hermitage, Paulina, Marshfield, and Ashland were already carved up by other crews, and a group claiming a patch of ground draws rivals whether it wants them or not. Gooni Boss drifted into the orbit of the gangster disciples and slowly stopped looking like the thing Alex built. It became a clique tied loosely to a bigger gang holding a few blocks as its own. The basketball stayed for a while. So did the fights. The two ran side by side, and then one of them won. The turn was gradual enough that no one could point to the day it happened. A name that started as a joke about being your own man hardened into something other crews recognized, and recognition on these blocks comes with the target. Claiming corners meant defending them. Defending them meant standing up to whoever pushed, and standing up meant the kind of escalation that has only one direction. Slights became confrontations, and confrontations became something worse. And with every round, the group had a little less of the club in it and a little more of the crew. The young men who had buried Albert and built something to honor him were still there. What they had built was simply becoming unrecognizable around them, and the person who would finish that transformation had not even arrived yet. Romeo Blackman fell in with Gooni Boss around 2011 when he was about 15 years old. He had been born in 1996 into a childhood almost no one talks about, with cocaine and alcohol already in his system, raised by a mother fighting her own addiction, surrounded by violence before he was old enough to understand what it was. Whatever shaped him left him with something the others did not carry. The crew called him O, then O-Dog. Before long, he started calling himself the Reaper, and he wore the name like a promise he intended to keep. He did not take control the way the old gangs handed power down through rank or a sit down or some quiet agreement among elders. He took it the simplest way there is. Whenever there was something to be done that no one else had the stomach for, he did it. And each time he did, his standing climbed and the group bent a little further around him. The founding idea, the one that gave the crew its name, that every man was his own boss, quietly died in those years. In its place stood a single figure whose willingness to kill set the price of everything. The others followed because following was safer than the alternative, and because fear, once it takes root in a group like that, does most of the work on its own. What the crew existed for changed with him. In the early days, it had been about belonging. Under Old Dog, it became about holding ground and being feared on it, claiming a few corners, keeping rivals off them, staying a step ahead of the police, and pulling in the guns and the money that kept the whole thing breathing through theft and intimidation when it came to that. None of it was written down. There were no ranks to earn and no oaths to swear. A kid from the block became part of it the way you become part of anything in a place like that, by being around, by being useful, and above all, by being willing. Willingness was the only real currency the crew traded in, and Old Dog had more of it than anyone. The first body the rest of the city would one day trace back to him, dropped in the dead of a Chicago winter. On January 22nd, 2014, 21-year-old Jonathan Johnson was shot dead in the 6900 block of South Racine. Johnson had been claiming ties to both Gooni Boss and a rival set at the same time, the kind of double life that, on these blocks, marks a man as loyal to no one and dangerous to everyone. He was barely older than the crew that ended him. He was the first, and the way he died set the temperature for everything that followed, because it announced a simple, ugly rule. Under Old Dog, suspicion alone could be a sentence. No proof had to be gathered, no offense had to be real. A whisper was enough, and the men around him learned that lesson fast. The way people always learn the rules that can get them killed. 2 months later, the pattern made itself plain. On March 21st, 2014, Alonzo Williams, 24, was killed in the 1200 block of West 70th Street. Williams ran with a clique that was supposed to be friendly to Gooni Boss, and that is the part that should chill you. Being on the same side bought him nothing. The old rules about who was safe and who was not had worn down to almost nothing, and standing close to the crew offered no protection once doubt crept in. That is the thread to keep your hand on through everything that comes next, because it runs all the way to a quiet town 2 hours south of the city, and the killing this whole story is named for. The danger Old Dog built did not stop at the edge of a rival's block. It pointed inward, at friends, at allies, at anyone whose loyalty could ever be questioned. By 2014, the killing stopped feeling like separate events and started feeling like a campaign with a logic all its own, cold and circular. There was no drug empire underneath Gooni Boss, no product to protect, no territory worth real money. There was only reputation, and on these blocks, reputation was built one body at a time. Respect flowed to whoever proved most willing to take a life, and Old Dog made certain that man was always him. The violence was rarely about money and only sometimes about revenge. More often, it was about standing, about staying the most feared name on a few square blocks, and a person could die simply because killing him made the crew look untouchable for another week. On October 23, 2014, 18-year-old Stanley Bobo was shot and killed in the 1400 block of West 72nd Street, with 2 more people wounded in the same stretch of gunfire. Bobo was younger than the men who killed him. That detail keeps repeating in this story until it stops sounding like a detail at all, because almost everyone in it, the dead and the ones who made them dead was still a kid by any honest measure. These were teenagers and barely grown men deciding who lived and who did not on corners most of the city drove past without slowing down. O-Dog did not carry the crew alone, even with his name sitting over all of it. A small core hardened around him in these years, the men who would one day stand at the center of the whole case. One went by T, a lieutenant whose name turned up beside a string of the shootings. Another, called Joe, worked as a planner and an enforcer and would later be caught on tape describing one of the crew's ugliest killings in his own flat voice. An older hand kept them supplied, and under them moved a layer of younger associates who absorbed the crew's logic and carried it on to the next block. One of them eventually charged in a killing of his own. There was no real hierarchy to any of it, no titles or territory you could draw on a map with confidence. There was only a center of gravity, and the center was O-Dog. Less than a month later, the violence reached someone who had nothing to do with any of it. On November 19, 2014, Crystal Jackson, 25, was killed as she sat in a car outside the Loomis Food Mart, two men beside her wounded. She had no gang ties, no place in the feud, no warning at all. She had stopped to get food. The crew came hunting someone else, and she died for sitting in the wrong car on the wrong evening. Her killing is the first point in the story where the cost landed squarely on the very neighborhood the Goonies claimed to belong to, and it would not be the last time an innocent name got added to the count. By now, the crew was wired into a web of feuds that fed on itself. They traded fire with Push Squad, with T-Love, with a rotating cast of cliques whose names shifted but whose role never did. Every killing demanded an answer, and every answer became the reason for the next one. The dead always had people, and those people came back, and the cycle turned faster with each passing year, swallowing rivals and bystanders alike without ever pausing to tell them apart. No single hand drove it once it was running. It simply turned, and feeding it became the closest thing the crew had to a purpose. What set this crew apart from the gangs that came before was that it performed. The whole operation lived online, out in the open, where the audience could see it. They filmed themselves, streamed it, taunted their enemies, bragged on Facebook, and printed their own Goonie t-shirts like a brand. The bravado built the legend in real time, and the young man posting it believed the attention was power. None of them understood yet that every clip and every caption was also a record, quietly stacking up somewhere, waiting to be read back to them years later in a room they could not walk out of. And beneath all the showmanship ran a deep current of paranoia, because a crew that kills on suspicion eventually learns to suspect everyone. Anyone who might talk to the police became a problem with one solution, and they even had a phrase for it, a piece of slang for walking a man to the backyard he would not come back from. That paranoia was not a side effect. It was the thing that held the crew together, and the thing that would eventually tear it apart, because a group bound by the fear of being told on has no way to tell loyalty from threat. Friends became suspects, suspects became targets, and the further the crew got from home, the more anyone outside its tight circle started to look like a risk that needed managing, which is exactly the logic that would one day reach a teenager in a town 2 hours away. The rival killings did not slow. On December 13, 2015, Andre Donner, 26, a member of Push Squad, was shot and killed in the 7200 block of South May Street. A month after that, on January 15, 2016, 19-year-old David Horace, known on the block as D-Money, was shot dead on South May, and his death pulled yet another clique onto the long list of people who wanted the Goonies wiped out. The map of their enemies kept widening, and a wider map only meant more corners to slide through, more reasons to ride out looking for someone to put down before someone put them down first. Then, in the spring of 2016, the violence reached its most senseless point. On May 26, the crew opened fire inside a barbershop, certain a rival was sitting in one of the chairs. There was no rival. The man they killed was Gerald Sayes, 38, a barber and a father of 5 with no connection to the streets at all. He was working through an ordinary weekday afternoon in a place that should have been about as safe as a place can be when the gunfire came through the door over a guest that turned out to be wrong. A whole family lost his father that day for nothing, and the men responsible barely broke stride. The bodies kept stacking through that summer. On June 20th, 2016, Ramal Hicks, 34, was killed outside a store in West Englewood. By this point, the count had grown past the size a mind can comfortably hold, and the men behind it were, most of them, still in their teens or only a year or two beyond. It is easy in a story this dense with names and dates to let the dead blur into a list. They were never a list to the people who buried them. 5 children grew up without Gerald Sayes. Crystal Jackson died running an errand a mile from home. Every rival who fell pulled a fresh circle of grieving relatives into the machine, and each of those relatives became a reason for someone, somewhere, to load up and plan the next one. For the people living on those blocks, this was not a string of headlines they could close out of. It was the air they breathed, a neighborhood where a barbershop, a corner store, and a parked car all carried the same low, constant threat year after year with no sign of when it might stop. There is one more thing to understand before the story reaches that farm town, and it is the simplest question of all. Where did the guns come from? Gooni Boss never ran on drug money, never controlled a corner worth fighting over in the way older gangs did. It ran on weapons. They smashed their way into a gun store, leaned on straw buyers, and reached as far as Michigan to keep themselves armed, and what little money they made moving drugs went right back into buying more firearms. Guns were the whole operation, the thing that made the rest of it possible. And a supply line like that depends on people willing to do the quiet, dangerous work of buying weapons in places where Chicago police are not watching, people the crew has to trust with the one secret that can sink them. One of those people was a teenager from a small town 2 hours south of the city. He trusted the wrong men, and his trust is where this story finally turns. Streator, Illinois, is farm country. Flat fields, grain elevators, a few thousand people, the kind of quiet that Chicago families sometimes move toward specifically to escape the thing that came for 19-year-old Gerald Bumper on June 30th, 2016. Bumper was no rival and no enemy from a neighboring block. He had been buying guns for Gooni Boss, feeding the crew's endless hunger for weapons from a town where no one would think to look for it. That was the value of a person like him. The crew depended on quiet hands far from Chicago, people who could acquire weapons without drawing the attention that follows the gang's own members everywhere they go. And a kid downstate was perfect for it, precisely because he stood outside the world the guns were headed into. He was useful right up until he wasn't. The men he served decided he had become a liability, that an outsider who had seen this much of their business might one day decide to talk, and the same paranoia that ran under everything they did turned on him. They killed him for it, far from the city, in the one place he should have been safe. This is the killing that gave the story its name. In the years since, the version told on Englewood blocks and passed around the internet has held that old dog crossed the single line even the streets are supposed to respect, that the kid he sent men to kill in that farm town was his own cousin, family by blood, ended over the fear that an outsider would break and bring everything down. It is the detail that turns a brutal record into a legend, and there's even a reason it took hold so easily. O-Dog borrowed his street name from one of the most infamous killers in 90s film, a character remembered in part for murdering one of his own. And over enough retellings, the man and the movie blurred together into a single sentence that sounds like settled fact. What is solid is colder and narrower than the legend. A teenager who had been buying the crew's guns was shot dead in Streator because the men he served feared he knew too much. Whether his blood truly ran the same as O-Dog's is the one thread this story could never tie off. The piece that lived in rumor and never made it into the record, even after the record would go on to prove nearly everything else about these men in painstaking detail. The killing is real and undisputed. The family tie is the place where the streets and the truth quietly separate, and it is worth being honest about that line, even when the louder version makes a better headline. What is not in doubt is that Streator sat near the very end. Within days, the violence turned and finally struck the family that had started all of it back in 2008. In early July 2016, Robert Vaughn, brother of Alex and brother of the murdered Albert, was shot and killed. The crew went hunting for whoever was responsible, and the hunt produced one more death built entirely on a mistake. On July 1st, 2016, they killed Kenneth Whitaker, 34, a security guard and a father of 3, the wrong man entirely. Whitaker was a stranger gunned down for a feud he had no part in, a working man supporting 3 kids who happened to fit some loose idea of a target. By then, the machine had stopped even pretending to aim. The crew would not get to bury that killing in the noise of the streets either. One of its own would later be caught describing it plainly in a recorded conversation he believed was private, and that recording would become one of the heaviest stones the whole case was built from. Robert's death broke something that years of killing had not. Alex Vaughn had built Gooni Boss out of grief in 2008, watched it curdle into a thing that murdered strangers and children, and now it had taken a second brother from him. So he did what almost no one in his position ever does. He turned. Already sitting in jail on a gun charge, he started recording the men he had come up with, capturing them in their own words, describing their own killings, and he helped pull apart what kept the whole machine running. It was not a clean redemption, and no one ever sold it as one. He carried a wire under an immunity deal, took payments for his cooperation, and walked out of his own case with probation, a founder turning on the thing he founded with his own freedom, riding on every word. The men he recorded would later call him every name there is for what he did. None of it changed the recordings, and the recordings were the beginning of the end. After that, the thing the crew never noticed gaining on them finally arrived. Years of Facebook bravado, undercover recordings, recovered guns matched to the shell casings left at crime scenes, all of it had been quietly stacking into a single picture that no one of them could see whole. The same performances that built the legend had been building the case against it the entire time. Every video that bragged about a shooting placed faces together. Every gun the crew bought could be traced, and every gun recovered could be tied to a scene. The men inside it had spent years treating the streets as an audience, and the audience had been keeping receipts. On October 26, 2018, the indictment came down. 23 alleged members, a sweeping racketeering case that reached for as many as 11 killings. There was an argument late in the process that a loose set of friends from a few blocks did not amount to a criminal enterprise in the eyes of the law, that there was nothing organized enough to charge this way. That argument failed, and once it did, the whole story could be told at once. Every scattered shooting from those years woven into one long pattern, with O-Dog standing at the center of it. The trial ran about 7 weeks in 2023. Alex Vaughn took the stand against the men he had built the crew with and laid out how a basketball club born from a brother's death had become a name that terrorized Englewood. He was not the only one to turn. The older hand who had kept the crew supplied with guns came over to the government's side as well, pleading guilty and trading the role of armorer for the role of witness. The recordings played in open court. The guns were tied to the bodies. On July 10, 2023, a federal jury convicted Blackman and his 2 top lieutenants of racketeering conspiracy, with Blackman and one of those men also convicted of violence in aid of racketeering. It landed as a landmark the moment the kind of law built to break the old mob families was turned on a social media era, street click, and made to hold. The crew that had spent years announcing itself online was undone in the end by its own appetite for an audience and by the one man inside it who decided he had seen enough. At sentencing, his lawyers reached for the only argument left to them, that he had been a teenager when the killing started, born already damaged, shaped by a childhood that never gave him a real chance. It bought him nothing. He was given life. Romeo Blackman did not die the way so many of the men in this story died, on a Chicago corner in a burst of gunfire before he reached 30. He simply disappeared into a federal prison, alive, every year ahead of him already accounted for, while the blocks he once ruled carried on without him, much as they had before. The case did not only take O-Dog, it took the crew. Between the federal charges and a wave of state cases against the younger members, Gooni Boss was hollowed out and then gone. Some of its men went away for the rest of their lives. Some were killed in the same street violence that had defined them. The rest scattered, slipped into other cliques, or simply aged out of a life that rarely lets anyone age out of it. The corners around 72nd and 73rd did not go quiet when the leadership was locked away, because the things that made the crew were never about one man, and removing him changed none of them. New names rose where the old ones fell. The violence found fresh hands to carry it. Englewood was left holding the same weight it had carried long before any of these young men were born, plus the weight of 2 years of bodies, a toll heavier than the charges ever fully managed to count. So the question the title raises deserves a straight answer, and the truth is quieter than the legend that grew up around it. He did not buy a throne by murdering his own family. He killed his way to the top of a small clique on a handful of Englewood blocks, and the people who paid for it were rivals and strangers, a barber, a security guard, a woman buying food, and a teenager in a farm town who had done nothing worse than buy the wrong man their guns. Whether that teenager was his blood is the part the streets added and the record never carried. What the record does carry is the rest of it, plain and proven, that the fear O-Dog built to make himself untouchable was the same fear that finally put a wire on a grieving brother, and that every body he stacked to become a king became, one by one, a reason he would spend the rest of his life behind a wall instead of ruling anything at all.